So I think it's actually a very exciting time to be part of structural heart with all of these new things coming out, but also an important time for us to really focus on, what's the value of these new devices that are coming out, and how can we make sure that we provide, not only the optimal clinical care for our patients, but also we provide also the optimal value for our healthcare system.
Welcome to Parallax by Ankur Kalra, a podcast produced by Radcliffe Cardiology to bring you a new angle of all things cardiology and the best from the US Cardiology Review. Published every second Monday, Ankur Kalra, MD, interventional cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, USA, speaks with legendary cardiologists, reviews late-breaking trials, and interviews authors of our latest and best US Cardiology Review articles. We call them #audio articles. Parallax is the effect whereby the position or direction of an object appears to differ when viewed from different positions. So this podcast is your fix of reliable updates on all things cardiology by someone from a non-traditional background who is always looking at the industry from a new angle. Now, here's your host, Ankur Kalra, MD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Parallax. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of having with me Dr. Baron on the show today. We were just talking off the line. It's been a year since we met in person at TCT last year, and we sort of briefly talked about her late-breaking clinical trial presentation at TCT last year. She had two of them. This was one of the two topics that she presented on. And, what we were discussing was that we both can't believe that it's actually been a year since, we've been together online talking. She, just to officially introduce her, Dr. Suzanne Baron is the Director of Interventional Cardiology Research at Lahey Clinic. And that's the Beth Israel Lahey system. So without much further ado, Suzanne, welcome on the show. And thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Tell us a little bit more about, how you got to where you are. So training, medical school residency, fellowship, and then sort of your early career phase and the mentors you encountered. I know this is like a long answer, but that's okay. It could be a long-winded answer. But we just wanted to get to know more about your career and your journey.
Sure. So I'm a Northeast girl at heart. I grew up just outside of Boston, and I went to college at Harvard, and then stayed in New England for med school. Went to med school at Yale, and then went back to Mass General in Boston to do all my training. I knew I wanted to do cardiology pretty early on. I was really just drawn to the physiology, behind cardiovascular disease. However, when I initially started my cardiology fellowship, I said, I'm definitely not going to do interventional cardiology. That seems like a tough lifestyle, and it might be fun to, get up in the middle of the night when I'm 30, but it's going to be less fun when I'm 50, and I'm not going to do that. And I started doing my interventional cardiology rotations and found that I really loved it. I thought the types of things that we could treat in the cath lab were neat. I loved the acuity of patient illnesses, and I really loved the teamwork aspect that really you just see in the cath lab, that there can be so much stuff going on outside that room, but the minute that you're in that room with the patient on the table, it's all about that patient, and everybody comes together to really work together and make sure that that patient gets the best care. And I really loved that. I was lucky enough that Dr. Igor Palacios, who is the head of the head of the interventional fellowship at that time, was super supportive of me. Really, really supportive, and said, I think even if you've got any doubts, you should really do this. And he was just so incredibly supportive, and I'm so grateful to him, because it made all the difference for, someone like that to take an interest in me and be so supportive as he was. And so I said, all right, I'm going to do this, and did my interventional cardiology fellowship and haven't looked back since. So I did that at Mass General. And then actually during my interventional fellowship, I really loved it. And I was kind of really fascinated by all of the devices that we got to use in the cath lab. This was right around when, TAVRs were just getting ready to come out onto the field, and you've got rotobladers and all sorts of cool things. And I really kind of wanted to learn a little bit more about, how do you evaluate these devices? And so the next year, I actually, I did two things. I went to Harvard School of Public Health, and I got my master's in clinical epidemiology so that I could kind of evaluate devices from that perspective. And then I actually spent a year working at the FDA in the division, Office of Device Evaluation, Division of Cardiac Devices. So I really got a sense of what, the regulatory pathways were for device approval. It was fascinating, really kind of opened up a huge kind of what had been a black box to me of how devices were approved and how they were evaluated. And I was really able to get this great perspective on that. I then came back to Mass General, did a year of structural interventional fellowship. So TAVRs, mitral clips, PFO, ASD closures, paravalvular leaks, all that good stuff. Again, very lucky to train under two great people, Dr. Palacios and Dr. Ignacio Iglesias, who were absolutely fabulous, incredible mentors. I then actually made the long turn from being a New England girl my whole life and moved out to Kansas City in Missouri, and was there for 5 years at Mid-America Heart Institute, which was an absolute great experience, just both clinically as well as from a research perspective. I was doing interventional cardiology there as well as structural, and was really very lucky there as well. They have such a great group of interventionalists there with a very rich history, with Jeff Hartzler having been there, with Barry Rutherford was part of the group. And now the current folks who are there, folks like Aaron Grantham, huge CTO guru, really very, very lucky to work with alongside some very talented interventionalists. And then I was able to continue some of my research with John Spurtis and Dave Cohen, who are both obviously well-known clinical outcomes researchers. And they were really able to mentor me into learning how to evaluate quality of life and how to evaluate devices from a health economics perspective. And so that was a great experience for me out in Kansas City. However, the New England called to me a little bit. My family is still up here. So after about 5 years, I was lucky enough to be able to be offered a job at Lahey as the director of interventional cardiology research. And so I migrated back to the Northeast last year, actually, where I've been and doing a lot of the same stuff, actually, doing all my clinical work, my interventional, coronary and structural procedures, and then continuing research both from a health economics perspective, but also as far as helping have Lahey become participate in some of the new trials that are coming out for new devices. So getting to see device evaluation from multiple different perspectives.
Yeah, no, excellent background. Actually, it's so I'm you. So it's I shouldn't say it's coincidence, but I've sort of followed your career, and you and I mean, I should say I share the same interests as you in terms of health economics research and outcomes research. I'm actually pursuing a master's in economics, outcomes, and management from the London School of Economics right now. It's an executive program, so I'm supposed to be in London 2 weeks in June and then 2 weeks in December for 2 years in succession. But I've sort of always wanted to be in this space, just like yourself. But I didn't have the opportunity to spend a year, with the FDA. Did try my hand at Harvard School of Public Health, but I think what precluded me from an admission there was they wanted me to give the GRE because I'm a foreign graduate. Right. I had not given the MCAT. So I was like, I don't want to spend time doing high school math.
No.
Rather look for, that's when I spoke with Dr. Bhatt, who's been a long time mentor to me at the Brigham, and he said, yeah, I agree with you. You might as well just focus on developing your clinical career and look for programs which can give you a similar skill set without having you to do the GRE, and that's where the LSE program came up. Thank you. So. But so how do you, this is something which I sort of struggle with, or I should say I try to hustle as much as I can, but, I do kind of, it's a struggle, and that is managing time between, clinically being busy in the lab because, as you know, it's extremely important for an early career person, an early career interventionalist, versus spending time doing clinical research, because for someone like me, I'm sure it's the same for you. You get a lot of fulfillment. I do at least get a lot of fulfillment if I'm, cognitively engaged in generating science and advancing the science and sort of doing relevant, projects, which, then, become, important manuscripts and papers that move the field in the right direction. That sort of is also very exciting. And then there's family. So how do you dabble and into all of these things and sort of still manage your time? I sort of ask that question to every person I look up to and follow their careers.
I wish there were more hours in the week. I bet everyone says the same thing. I'm with you. It's busy because I feel exactly the same way that you do. I think it's really important as an early career interventionalist to remain clinically busy and to be procedurally, proficient. I really don't ever, want to be the person, that, goes to the lab, a half a day a week or something like that, because I want to feel that I'm proficient and giving, the best procedural care to my patients. And so I right now split my time about, 70 to 75% of my time is spent clinical, and the other 25 to 30% is spent doing research. And most, I would say probably, I'm in the lab 2.5, 3 days a week, doing procedures, whether they're coronaries or structural. And then the rest, like I said, the rest of the time that I'm doing research is research. But I think you can probably attest to this as well. To really do clinical research, it isn't just that 20 to 30% of time out of a 40-hour work week, because we all know we don't really work 40-hour work weeks. So it's a lot of nights, it's a lot of weekends. But like you said, I think it's very cognitively rewarding to kind of have that type of challenge and in your life beyond just doing procedures. It's just another way of kind of challenging yourself, and I really do love it. I'm very lucky that I have a very understanding spouse who is incredibly supportive of me, and so he's absolutely fabulous about supporting. When I'm like, I'm staying up late and writing a paper, or what, this weekend I gotta buckle down and do some analyses and stuff, and that certainly is very, very helpful. But I think it comes a lot from the fact that he sees how much I love it and how important it is to me, and how much it really drives me.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I sort of, one of my really good friends who's a cardiologist at UT Southwestern, he's incredibly productive. Someone who inspires me is Ambrish Pandey, and him and I chat, every now and then. We're both from the same institution in India, at the All India Institute, and he was my intern when I was a resident. All these years down the road, we're both in the U.S. and we're both involved in academic medicine, and we sort of joke around at times and call each other weekend warriors. It's like, yeah, we're all weekend warriors, trying to get stuff done over the weekends. I agree with you. It's
Yep.
I think what
Yep.
at least keeps me moving is just the excitement and the passion that surrounds clinical investigation, and it's something that I'm fortunate that I possess and I have, because otherwise it could get pretty daunting, right, to get these things done and get these things accomplished in a timely
Absolutely.
fashion. I'm just going to dive right into the topic, and thank you for making the contribution to US Cardiology Review on your paper, which is a clinical trial perspective, and that is cost effectiveness of edge-to-edge transcatheter mitral valve repair versus medical therapy in patients with heart failure and secondary mitral regurgitation. And these are the results from the COAPT trial. Just to start the discussion, give us a bit of a background. Why do you think this topic is of importance? Why do you think it has gained traction and attention from all of us? Particularly secondary mitral regurgitation. I think the audience would benefit from your viewpoints on these questions.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's actually a couple of things to parse out there. I mean, I think in general, when we're talking about new technologies in healthcare, I mean that's kind of a lightning rod topic these days, because we've done so much innovation in technology over the last 20 some odd years, but all of these things cost money, and so it's our wants. Our wants are unlimited of what we can do and how we can treat patients. But the reality is our resources, our healthcare money, and what we can expend is limited. And so at a certain point, you have to really make decisions regarding resource allocation. And in a way to do that is to decide what is the value of a new technology when you're applying it to a specific disease process. Now, in the case of secondary mitral regurgitation, that's something that really up until the MitraClip, we didn't have great treatments for. Certainly there's medical therapy, but we know folks weren't doing particularly great with that. And then there's the question of surgical repair. And the studies beyond that whereas for primary mitral regurgitation, we know that surgical repair replacement, certainly does portend good outcomes. But for secondary mitral regurgitation, it really hasn't, and it only receives a class 2B indication in the guidelines. So you really had this area where we didn't have great technology to treat patients. And so there was this opening, I think, for the MitraClip to come in. And we saw what it showed. And we saw that in COAPT in particular, that outcomes were significantly better when we compared them to medical therapy. The question comes up then again, that's great. What does it cost? What is the value? How do we define that value? What is the value to our patients? What is the value to the healthcare system? And what is the value to our society? And I think in that situation, again, with a new technology to treat a certain disease process, those are questions that we really need to ask, especially in this day and age.
Excellent. So, just to get the audience up to speed on the details of the COAPT trial, would you mind summarizing that for us? What was the question that the COAPT trial was trying to address, and maybe just if you could touch upon some of the background medical therapy that patients were on, and then with the technology that you described that is important for secondary mitral regurgitation, which until maybe the COAPT was really an orphan disease with no specific targeted therapies for it, and patients presenting with heart failure. I think if you could touch on both those aspects and just sort of parse them out for the listenership, I think that'll be great learning points for us.
Absolutely. So the COAPT trial randomized just over 600 patients. They were patients who had symptomatic severe secondary mitral regurgitation, and they were randomized to either receive goal-directed medical therapy or treatment with the MitraClip, which is percutaneous edge-to-edge MitraClip repair. For patients to be included into the trial, they had to remain symptomatic after being on optimized medical therapy. And so that was things that included, ACE inhibitors, ARBs, diuretic therapy, and even technology treatments as well, things like CRT therapy as well. And so these were patients that, despite us giving them the best of the medical therapy that we could do, and that medical therapy was determined to be the best by a heart failure expert, they still remained symptomatic. And so they were then randomized to continue to receive medical therapy or to be treated with the MitraClip. Patients were followed for 2 years was the plan, a minimum of 1 year, but the final endpoint was at 2 years. And, it was an interesting thing that this trial did. They made their primary endpoint repeat heart failure hospitalizations, which is an interesting thing because when you look at this patient population, that's something that we're really trying to decrease, again, from a quality of life standpoint, as well as from a resource allocation standpoint. How can we decrease these folks coming into the hospital with heart failure exacerbations? And so what they found is that patients who received the MitraClip had a substantially lower rate of heart failure hospitalizations at 2 years when compared with folks who were just being treated with medical therapy. I think the surprising thing, and the thing that nobody really expected to find, was that they also saw a mortality benefit. Really, the expectation is that the MitraClip would reduce heart failure exacerbations, but wouldn't really change, the overall progression of and prognosis of the disease. But they actually saw almost a 50% decrease in mortality with treatment from MitraClip when compared to goal-directed therapy. And so in that setting, this trial was really considered a real success and offered now a way to treat patients with this disease process, kind of, as you said, this kind of orphan disease process. We now had something to treat them with that we didn't have prior to this.
Absolutely. So, for the audience now, I know you're sort of an expert in this area with cost effectiveness analyses, and something which is of interest to me in person also because healthcare resource allocation and utilization is a personal area of interest for me as well. If you want to just explain to the listenership and to the audience, what sort of goes in to the analytical aspects of cost effectiveness analysis. So, for example, if you want to pick up a therapy, whether it's device or drug, and, you sort of decide, okay, I really want to see if this is cost effective from a population health perspective or a population health standpoint. What are some of the tools that you would exercise or, you would sort of pull out of your toolbox as an analyst for you to be able to answer that question? How are you going to model, the analysis for you to be able to derive, scientifically valid conclusions?
Sure, absolutely. So, when we think about cost effectiveness analyses, it exactly kind of the name says it all, right? We're basically what we're doing is we're trying to balance or compare what are the costs of this treatment versus what is the benefit that patients receive. And in most settings, what we're doing is we're not just looking at what is the cost versus the benefit of one treatment. We're looking at what is the cost versus benefit between treatments. So in the case of the CoAPT trial, it is what is the difference in costs between MitraClip therapy and goal-directed medical therapy versus what are the benefits gained between these, with the benefits gained, difference in benefits gained between these two therapies. So the way that we do that, or the way that health economists do that, is we actually calculate something called an incremental cost effectiveness ratio, or an ICER. And what an ICER again is it essentially compares the differences of cost between treatments with the differences of benefits between treatments. So we first need to do that. We need to think about what are the cost of each of these treatments. And it includes a lot of things. It includes the cost of the index procedure. So what is the cost of the device, for example? What is the cost of, the wires and the IV tubing and the sheaths and the surgical equipment that go into doing a procedure like the MitraClip? It also has to include things like the overhead cost of the procedure room. So, these procedures take up an OR or a hybrid cath lab. How do we factor in the depreciation of the cost of that room or the personnel who are in that room? Then you got to think about what's the cost of the index hospitalization besides the procedure. So do patients end up staying in the hospital for 5 days? Are they in an ICU? Are they requiring other procedures afterwards? For example, we think about TAVR, are they going to need a pacemaker after the procedure or not? And then it's follow-up medical costs as well. So those are things like, well, patients get rehospitalized. That costs money. Do patients need to, after they get the procedure done, do they end up going to long-term care facilities or short-term rehabs? And then all of the things that come with just outpatient care, medication costs, emergency room visits, clinic visits, and then doctor fees as well. So we have to add all of those up, not only over just the duration of a trial, perhaps, but we have to think about this from a lifetime perspective as well. And then we have to think about benefits. And really one of the things that I think is important when you think about benefits, we can think of it in very kind of black and white terminology of, well, does the person live longer? Mortality, longer life. That's absolutely a very, kind of black and white way to view benefits. But I would say that I don't think it's the only way. And certainly I think we need to, and I think most people would agree with this, that we need to also weigh in the fact of quality of life in addition to quantity of life. So most patients would say, and I think all of us would say, I wouldn't necessarily want to live longer if I'm living in a coma. I want to live longer, but I want it to be a good quality of life if I'm living longer. And there have been studies that have actually shown, particularly in elderly patients, that they value quality of life over quantity. So when you're looking at how do you measure the benefits of a procedure or benefits of a new technology, you really want to use a metric that incorporates both quality and quantity of life. And so what that's generally comes to is called quality adjusted life years. And so that's been the most common way to combine both quality of life and survival into a single metric. And so basically what we end up doing to get our incremental cost effectiveness ratios, we take the difference in the cost between the treatments, and then we take the difference in what we say the QALYs gained, or the quality adjusted life years gained between the treatments, and we come up with a number. And so based on that number, we can decide is something good value or not from a societal perspective.
Well, excellent discussion, and thank you for really defining those two terms for us, for the listenership. I think for those of us who are early career or fellows in training or residents, essentially people in their formative years and who want to sort of dabble into cost effectiveness analyses and health economics, these are important terms to know about and conceptually think about and sort of be facile with, or even if you don't want to dabble into these these kinds of analyses, but are sort of examining a paper of this sort. I do think having background knowledge and information on incremental cost effectiveness ratio and quality adjusted life years, just the way Suzanne explained it, I think are key concepts for understanding what you're reading. So, with that background, Suzanne, then why don't you go over the results, that you presented, last year at TCT, and also, sort of what you've discussed in this paper here in US Cardiology Review.
Sure. So, I certainly think that, again, when any new technology comes or is going for a new indication or comes onto the market, I think it's really important to think about value. And kind of going back to what you just said, actually, about how it's important for, early career folks or anybody who's just reading this type of paper to really understand what an incremental cost effective ratio is. I absolutely agree with you. Because at the end of the day, even if you're not going to do health economic research, understanding the importance of these types of analyses and value certainly help all of us be better stewards of healthcare. Not that cost should drive, what we choose to do for our patients, obviously not, but, kind of taking that broader picture and letting us really think about how these different new technologies really can fit into our toolbox to treat our patients and when's the most appropriate and the best value of which ones to use. And so that's, I think, kind of why it was important to make sure that this was a study that was done for the COAPT trial. Because basically you've got a large population of patients who could be eligible for this procedure. Patients, we see a lot of patients with severe secondary mitral regurgitation who remain symptomatic. And we really have to think about if we've got an expensive technology like the MitraClip and a large population of patients who can be treated, we really have to be able to quantify what the value is of this procedure. And so this was a formal, so what we did is we had a formal health economic analysis that was conducted alongside the COAPT trial and embedded with it during the time of the trial duration. And so we went ahead, we costed all aspects of in-trial costs, including the index MitraClip hospitalization, which included the procedure as well as the non-procedural costs. And then we did follow-up costs as well, which again included all rehospitalizations, post-acute care, outpatient visits, medications, things like that over 2 years. And then we also, looked at the difference in survival at 2 years, as well as the difference in quality of life at 2 years. And then taking all of that in-trial data, we essentially created models to calculate over each patient's lifetime what their lifetime costs would be and their lifetime quality adjusted survival was predicted to be. And we were able to, at that point, calculate up an ICER. So one of the things that we found is that the follow-up costs over the in-trial period were significantly lower with the MitraClip group. And that makes sense. We know that was driven by a decrease in heart failure hospitalizations in particular, which is what the clinical results of the COAPT trial showed. That said, there's an upfront cost of the MitraClip, the procedure itself. Obviously folks who were being just treated with medical therapy had no upfront cost. They just had the same medicines that they had been on before, whereas the index hospitalization, we estimated it costing just over $48,000. So automatically, you're in the hole for $48,000. And so because of those kind of higher upfront costs, even though there was a significant decrease in follow-up costs, the overall lifetime costs for MitraClip therapy were estimated to be just over $45,000 when compared to medical therapy. But there was the benefit. As we talked about, there was lower heart failure hospitalizations, and folks lived longer when they were treated with the MitraClip, and their quality of life was better when they were treated with the MitraClip. And so we projected a lifetime increase in quality adjusted life expectancy of 0.82 years. So when we do the math, when we calculate out what the cost versus the benefit ratio is, and we calculate out our incremental cost effectiveness ratio, it came to $55,600 per quality adjusted life year gained when compared to medical therapy. Now, it's always hard to think or know really, is that good value or not? And $55,000 is a lot of money. Is that something that's considered good value? The AHA and ACC, with the help of the World Health Organization, have made benchmarks to what's considered good value. And essentially it's one GDP per capita per quality gained is considered to be good value, whereas upper limit of normal would be 3 to be considered poor value. So in the U.S., back in 2011, when they made these guidelines, the GDP was about $50,000. So what's considered right now is that a threshold of $50,000 per quality gained is considered to be of good economic value, whereas a threshold of anything over $150,000 or 3 times $50,000 would be considered to be poor economic value. So given an incremental cost effectiveness ratio of the MitraClip at $55,600, we're pretty close to that threshold of high economic value in the United States.
Absolutely. That was a great discussion and also a great explanation of how to interpret these results. So thank you for discussing and bringing up gross domestic product and how that value plays into the decision making process with regard to whether a particular intervention, in this instance, a device therapy with MitraClip, is of economic value, to the U.S. healthcare system. So have you in your practice, Suzanne, have you seen an uptick in the number of MitraClip cases? At Lahey or where you were before. I know you recently transitioned over to Lahey, so just an observation. Because I think I have in person. I have seen an uptick in the number of functional mitral regurgitation patients that are now getting this therapy? I just wanted to get a perspective from you.
Yep, no, I absolutely agree with you. I've certainly seen an uptick, not only in the referrals, but also in the patients that we have been doing. And that certainly has increased since the results of COAPT came out. It's an interesting thing because I certainly think it's something that this is, I think, a great therapy for the right patient. But I think the key is it's got to be the right patient. Because the elephant in the room, or I know has been discussed many times, is the MITRA-FR trial, which is the same patient was designed to be the same patient population, but certainly didn't have the results that COAPT had. Again, they compared same idea, goal-directed medical therapy, compared it to MitraClip therapy in patients who had secondary, severe symptomatic mitral regurgitation, and they didn't find the same benefits that were seen in COAPT. There was no mortality benefit was seen, and there was no significant change in heart failure hospitalizations. And when those trials were scrutinized side by side, as it turns out, the patient populations were different. Even though they on paper appeared to be initially the same, there was some substantial differences to them. The patients in MITRA-FR, it seemed that they had worse LV dysfunction, and maybe not quite as severe mitral regurgitation as the COAPT patients. And there was also, it was noted that patients in the MITRA-FR trial weren't required to be on optimal, maximal doses of guideline-directed medical therapy at the start of the trial. They were able to kind of increase as the trial went on. So there were some significant differences in the patient populations, and I think that's an important thing to think about as we see the number of MitraClip procedures going up for patients with secondary MR. It really needs to be in the patients who most closely fit into the COAPT trial, because first of all, we want to give benefit to our patients. We want them to feel better. We want to know that we're doing a procedure that's going to benefit them. And the MITRA-FR patients didn't see that same benefit. But again, also from a healthcare, economic standpoint, there was no formal cost effectiveness analysis that was done of the MITRA-FR trial, but it doesn't matter. We know what it would show. It didn't show that the device was effective. So by definition, the cost effectiveness ratio was not going to be in favor in that patient population. So I think given that we are seeing this uptick, I think it becomes even more important both from a patient care standpoint as well as from a health system standpoint to really make sure that we're good stewards of our resources and really do apply this technology to those patients who are closest to the COAPT patients, and therefore will actually see a benefit that's of good value.
Absolutely. Now let me ask you this, Suzanne, because I know this has come up at least in my thought process. When I'm taking care of these patients. And I'm sure, this is the scenario in a lot of these centers that are offering structural heart therapies for their patients. I'm assuming you would work in close concert with your heart failure colleagues because, they see a lot of these patients. And my question to you is, at what point in the natural evolution of this disease process do you say, okay, we've had enough, we've trialed enough with medical therapy, and we don't see an improvement, either from a symptom. Well, I think if it's a symptom-driven improvement, it's sort of easier to catch. But what if the patient is not symptomatic, but you have like maybe New York Heart Association Class 2 symptoms? I shouldn't say entirely asymptomatic, but what if the patient has New York Heart Association Class 2 symptoms? EF is about 35%. Now the patient is on an angiotensin neprilysin inhibitor, a beta blocker, a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. Okay, and also now an SGLT2 inhibitor, which I'm not sure was part of the armamentarium at the time COAPT was done because it wasn't standard of care. But say you have the patient on all these therapies, and you'd be like, the patient sort of getting along and going by. Yes, there's moderate to severe MR, but at what point in time, I don't know if I was able to articulate my question well enough for you to understand it as to where I'm coming from, but at what point would you say, okay, we think it's time to intervene, let's discuss MitraClip for this patient?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, that's the reality, right? These trials end up being snapshots in time. You brought up a couple of really good things, right? Some of the things that we do treat our patients with now weren't really being used that much in the COAPT trial because they weren't really available at the time. So the SLGP2s, the Entresto, things like that, which certainly can affect cost as well as outcomes. And those weren't necessarily being used. So, you automatically, when you got a patient who's on those things, do they really fit into CoAPT? And then you brought up the question of, symptoms. Well, somebody's got some symptoms, but they're not really that symptomatic. And, how do you start weighing the cost benefit ratio of going in and doing a procedure on a patient that has risk and cost, risk to the patient, cost to the health system? When you're not totally sure exactly what the benefit's going to be, because we know this patient didn't necessarily fit into CoAPT, but they didn't necessarily fit into MITRA-FR either. And I really think this is one of the things that there's such a benefit of both the heart team approach to these types of patients that we're seeing, with all the structural heart patients, really that started with TAVR, as well as the process of shared decision making, really taking the time to, sit with the patient and really kind of get a sense of what their preferences are, what their values are, how limited are they from their symptoms, how willing are they to undergo a procedure that carries not a ton of risk, but some, nothing's risk-free, and really getting into it with the patient and their family about what are the benefits that you may be able to expect? What can we guarantee? Can we guarantee anything? And what are the risks that will come to that? I think certainly from my perspective, one of the things I've learned over the last several years as structural heart has grown, that the importance of patient input and frank discussions about what's known and what's not known has become so important. And I think has really served to further the doctor-patient relationship for sure. I think there will be indication creep. I think that's just a reality with any new technology, because it's just, as we get something that we can treat people with, we start to say, well, if we can kind of go, well, maybe we treat the person who's got class 2 symptoms and not class 3. But what if we treat asymptomatic people? Will they still see that mortality benefit? I mean, that's, that had nothing to do with quality of life. That was frank mortality. And I think it will be interesting to see over time, since the indication creep will likely happen, but a randomized control trial looking at those patients might not. It will be interesting to see over time how real world data ends up comparing to the COAPT trial data as well as the MITRA-FR data.
Any closing remarks for this paper and for the field of transcatheter mitral valve repair in general from you, Suzanne?
Yeah, sure. I think, like I said, I think the CoAPT trial was a big win for our patients, giving this patient population something to treat them with that we weren't able to offer before. But, we know that MitraClip is not the only, it's not the only game in town, and that there are many other devices that are under investigation right now. Percutaneous mitral valve replacements, there's spacing devices, there's devices that are mimicking surgical annuloplasty. So we've got a lot of things coming out in the pipeline. And it will be interesting to see how these new devices, not only how do these new devices fare from a clinical standpoint, but then what their cost effectiveness will be compared to either the MitraClip or to surgical mitral valve replacement. So I think it's actually a very exciting time to be part of structural heart with all of these new things coming out, but also an important time for us to really focus on, what's the value of these new devices that are coming out, and how can we make sure that we provide, not only the optimal clinical care for our patients, but also we provide also the optimal value for our healthcare system.
Great. So, Suzanne, thanks again. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for sharing your journey with us and also some of the other answers that you shared. obviously, thanks for your contribution to US Cardiology Review.
No, that was great. I really appreciate you having me on the show. This was a lot of fun and really enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah, no, likewise. Thank you. Thanks again. And I'll talk to you soon.
Dear cardiologists, we want to make this podcast about you and for you. So please email us your critical thoughts, comments and questions at podcast@radcliffe-group.com and visit uscjournal.com for more information. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram at Radcliffe Cardiology for daily updates. Join thousands of cardiologists and become a Radcliffean by registering to radcliffecardiology.com. You will receive regular newsletters and gain access to hundreds of expert interviews, educational webinars, clinical cases, and peer-reviewed articles from our 6 medical review journals on general cardiology, interventional cardiology, arrhythmia and electrophysiology, cardiac failure, and vascular and endovascular surgery. Thank you.